There is a printed book in the Kyujanggak Institute for Korean Studies at Seoul National University. It is bound in the style of the Joseon dynasty. Paper is mulberry, and the characters were carved into woodblocks and pressed onto the page in the year 1512. The book is called the Samguk Yusa, the Memorabilia of the Three Kingdoms. It is a 5-volume work. Kyujanggak copy is one of the oldest surviving complete editions, and it carries the formal designation of a Korean national treasure. Text inside is older than the printing. It was compiled around 1281 by a Buddhist monk named Iryeon, who lived from 1206 to 1289. In the opening pages of that text, before the histories of the kingdoms begin, there is a foundation account. Gives a specific date. It names a specific mountain. It describes a descent from the sky. What happens when you read it not as mythology, not as religious symbolism, but as what it appears to be, is one of the strangest and most under-discussed stories in the comparative study of ancient civilizations. Samguk Yusa runs to approximately 140,000 Chinese characters across its 5 volumes. Iryeon wrote in literary Chinese, the scholarly language of medieval Korea, and he drew on older sources that no longer exist as independent documents. Some of those sources are named in the text. Others are paraphrased. The foundation account appears in the first volume, in a section that Iryeon labels with care, distinguishing what he is transcribing from what he is summarizing. The account names 3 figures. The first is Hwanin, described as the heavenly ruler. The second is Hwanung, identified as the son of Hwanin. The third is Dangun, the founder of Gojoseon, the first Korean state. Text states that Hwanung descended from the heavens to the peak of Mount Taebaek with a retinue of 3,000 followers. It says he brought with him knowledge of agriculture, of medicine, of the calendar, of law. It assigns him 3 subordinate figures, identified by elemental titles: the Earl of Wind, the Master of Rain, the Master of Clouds. And it gives a date for the founding of Gojoseon by his son Dangun. That date is 2333 BCE. The date is the anchor. It is not approximate in the text. It is not a poetic flourish. It is a calendar record that Korean historians have used continuously for several centuries to count the Dangi era, an alternative calendar in which the present year is counted from that foundation. 2333 BCE places the founding of Gojoseon roughly contemporaneous with the rise of the Old Kingdom in Egypt, with the early Sumerian dynasties of Mesopotamia, and within a few centuries of the construction of the first Chinese state-level polities along the Yellow River. The book itself, as a physical object, dates to the Joseon dynasty, but the contents are older. Iryeon was working from a base of Korean documents that he describes as the old records, the Gogi, and from Chinese sources that referenced Korea from outside. The conventional academic position is that the Dangun account is mythological, that it was a religious foundation legend assembled in the medieval period to give the Korean state an ancient pedigree. The alternative reading, advanced by Korean historians beginning in the late 19th century and continuing through the 20th, is that the account contains a stratum of older information, that the descent narrative, the specific date, the 3,000 followers, the elemental subordinates, and the named mountain are not invented but transmitted. Something happened, or was believed to have happened, at a specific time in a specific place, and that the text is the record of that belief. This reading has been challenged. It has not been refuted on its specific claims. No mainstream academic paper has published a counter-analysis showing why the date of 2333 BCE was generated, or What alternative chronology accounts more economically for the consistent transmission of that date across multiple medieval Korean sources? The orthodox position is that the account is mythology, post. The alternative reading is that the mythology encodes something older. The disagreement is real, and the alternative reading is available to any researcher who wants to check the primary text. If you find that the academic literature on East Asian Foundation texts has been incomplete, if you suspect that the Samguk Yusa contains records sitting in plain sight, waiting for someone to read them with the same seriousness given to Sumerian tablets and Egyptian inscriptions, this channel is for that work. Subscribe only if that is the question you have been looking for. The rest of us continue. The orthodox account of the Samguk Yusa, taught in Korean universities and in the small number of Western departments that teach Korean history, treats the text as a 13th century literary compilation. Iryeon was a senior Buddhist cleric. He held the title of state preceptor under King Cheongnyeol of the Goryeo dynasty. He compiled the Samguk Yusa in his old age, drawing on older Korean records, on Chinese historical works, on Buddhist scriptures, and on local oral tradition. The orthodox dating places the composition of the Samguk Yusa in the period around 1281, give or take a few years. The earliest extant manuscripts date to the late 13th and early 14th centuries, with the standard reference edition being the printed Joseon copy of 1512. Korean scholars, including Ki-baek Lee, in his standard work A New History of Korea, treat the foundation account as a Buddhist-influenced retelling of older shamanistic Korean tradition, recast in a literary framework appropriate to medieval Buddhist historiography. The conventional reading of the Dangun narrative, in the form that appears in standard textbooks, runs roughly as follows. The figure of Hwanin is a heavenly ruler, identifiable in Buddhist terms with Indra, the king of the Triastrimsa heaven in Buddhist cosmology. Iryeon, as a Buddhist monk, would naturally have framed older Korean tradition in terms his readers would recognize. Figure of Hwanung represents a son of that heavenly ruler who descends to earth carrying the seal of his father's authority, and who founds a settlement. Figure of Dangun is born from a union between Hwanung and a bear woman, a totemic figure interpreted by mainstream Korean scholars as representing the merger of a sky cult clan with an indigenous bear clan, the founding of Gojoseon. In this reading, encodes the political consolidation of a number of clans on the Korean peninsula into something resembling a state. The conventional date of 2333 BCE is treated as a literary device. Iryeon's source for that specific number in the standard reading is a Chinese chronological tradition associating the founding of Korea with the reign of the legendary Chinese emperor Yao. The date is calculated in this reading by working backward from Yao's traditional reign dates. It is not, in the orthodox view, an independent Korean chronological tradition. It is a medieval back projection generated by Iryeon or by his sources for the purpose of harmonizing Korean foundation with the Chinese chronological framework. 3,000 followers are read as a literary convention. The Earl of Wind, the Master of Rain, and the Master of Clouds are read as personified weather phenomena, common in East Asian religious literature, drawn from a long-standing Chinese tradition of celestial bureaucracy. Mount Taebaek is identified, in the standard reading, with one of several mountains in northern Korea, or in what is now northeastern China, the most commonly proposed being Mount Paktu on the Korean-Chinese border. The descent is read as a religious motif paralleling other East Asian foundation accounts, in which sacred figures arrive from above to establish kingship. This reading is internally coherent. It situates the Samguk Yusa within a comparative framework of medieval foundation literature. It accounts for the Buddhist vocabulary that flavors Iryeon's transcription. It explains the date by reference to a known Chinese chronological tradition, and it treats the descent narrative as a religious motif, rather than a literal account. It is not a foolish reading. Mainstream Korean academia has, over more than a century of modern historical scholarship, developed this framework with care. Mark Peterson and Donald Baker, working in American universities on Korean history, broadly follow this conventional approach. Reading is the default, and any alternative analysis has to engage with it rather than dismiss it. But the conventional reading has gaps. It does not specifically account for why this date, of all possible dates a 13th century Buddhist monk might have chosen, does not specifically account for why the followers are numbered at 3,000 and not at some round literary figure. And it does not engage with the deeper question of what older Korean material Iryeon was working from, since most of that material has been lost. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a Korean historian named Sin Chae-ho began re-examining the Samguk Yusa and its companion text, the Samguk Sagi, from a perspective that broke with the Confucian-influenced framework dominant in late Joseon scholarship. Sin Chae-ho was born in 1880 in South Cheongjeong Province. He studied at Sungkyunkwan, the Royal Confucian Academy in Seoul. He became a journalist and a historian. He lived through the Japanese annexation of Korea in 1910, fled to Manchuria and then to Beijing, worked in exile for the Korean independence movement, was arrested by the Japanese in 1928, and died in a Japanese prison on the Liaodong Peninsula in 1936. He was 56 years old. Sin's relevant work for our purposes is his Joseon Sangosa, his ancient history of Joseon, which he wrote in the early 1920s, and which was published in serial form in Korean newspapers after his death. Book is a rereading of the early Korean past on the basis of the surviving textual record. Sin's argument, in summary, is that Korean historiography under late Joseon Confucian scholarship had systematically subordinated Korean origins to Chinese chronology. The Samguk Yusa's foundation account had been read down rather than read up, and that the date of 2333 BCE, the geography of the descent, and the specifics of the three subordinate figures were not arbitrary literary inventions, but transmitted memory. Sin Chae-ho is not fringe in Korea. He is one of the founders of modern Korean nationalist historiography, and his portrait has appeared on Korean currency. Challenge that his work poses for the conventional reading is that he was not a credulous popular writer. He was a trained historian, fluent in literary Chinese, who read the Samguk Yusa in the original and concluded, on textual grounds, that the foundation account preserved something older than 13th century Buddhist literary convention. Sin's methodology was simple. He read every available pre-modern Korean text that mentioned Dangun, every Chinese text that referenced Korea before the Han dynasty, and every Japanese text that referenced the Korean peninsula. He charted the date of 2333 BCE across the entire surviving Korean tradition. He found that the date appears consistently in different Korean sources with the same value across centuries. This consistency, he argued, is not easily explained by the hypothesis that a single 13th century monk invented the date. It is more economically explained by the hypothesis that the date was transmitted, that it was already established in Korean tradition before Iryeon wrote, and that Iryeon was recording rather than inventing. Break in the conventional reading is the date itself. Mainstream scholarship treats the date as derivative of Chinese chronology. Sin Chae-ho's analysis, which has not been refuted in its specific textual claims, is that the date is not derivative, that it appears in Korean sources independent of the Chinese back projection, and that the Chinese chronology was harmonized to it rather than the reverse. The implications of this reading begin to multiply. If the date is genuinely transmitted, then the question becomes what it is transmitting. Specific year, calculated to the lunar month in some readings, requires either an event sufficiently dramatic to anchor a long oral tradition, or a continuous written record stretching back from the medieval period into deep antiquity. Korean scholarship has long held that no such written record could have survived. The peninsula has been invaded repeatedly. Libraries have burned. Hwanden Gogi, a controversial Korean text that claims to preserve such pre-Iryeon records, is regarded by most mainstream Korean historians as a 20th century compilation rather than an authentic medieval document. Sin Chae-ho did not depend on the Hwanden Gogi. His argument was made from the texts that are uncontested: the Samguk Yusa, the Samguk Sagi, the Chinese annals, and the surviving inscriptions. From those uncontested texts, he concluded that the conventional reading of the Dangun account systematically underweighted what the text says. What the text says, when read on its own terms, is this: heavenly figure descended to a specific mountain with a specific number of followers, brought specific cultural technologies, and founded a state at a specific date. Text. The text does not say this happened symbolically. Text presents it as a foundation event in the same tone that Chinese chronicles present the founding of the Xia or the Shang. Sin Chae-ho was not a fringe figure. He was the founder of modern Korean nationalist historiography. His face is on the currency. And, in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a small group of Korean scholars working in archaeology and comparative religion have begun extending Sin's textual analysis with material evidence from the Northeast Asian Bronze Age. That material evidence is the next part of this story. It is the part that has, so far, not been brought into the comparative discussion with the Mesopotamian record, because what was happening in northeastern China and on the Korean peninsula in the 3rd millennium BCE, the period that the Samguk Yusa names as the founding date, was not nothing. It was a culture. It was a sophisticated culture. It built mounds, it built temples. It made jade objects of extraordinary technical refinement. And it has been excavated by Chinese archaeologists working in Liaoning province since the 1980s. The break, then, is this. The text gives a date. The date has been transmitted consistently in Korean sources. The conventional reading treats the date as a literary back projection. Sin Chae-ho's analysis, which has not been refuted, treats it as transmitted memory. And the archaeological record from the same era and the same broad geographic zone shows a civilization that the text could plausibly be remembering. The most important archaeological evidence for this implication is the new Heliang complex in western Liaoning province, China. Heliang was first surveyed in the 1980s by Chinese archaeologists. The site is part of the larger Hongshan culture, which extended across what is now Liaoning, Inner Mongolia, and Hebei provinces. The Hongshan culture has been dated by Chinese radiocarbon work to between approximately 4,700 BCE and 3000 BCE, with the New Heliang ceremonial complex itself dating to roughly 3,500 to 3000 BCE. That date range matters. Overlaps with the Korean foundation date of 2333 BCE on the late end, and it precedes that date by several centuries on the early end, places a sophisticated ceremonial culture in the geographic zone Korean tradition associates with Hwanyung's descent and Dangun's founding. What is at New Heliang? There is a goddess temple, partly subterranean, containing fragments of a life-sized clay female figure with inset jade eyes, There are stepped platforms. The largest in the area is a stone-faced earthen mound with a roughly square base, several tens of meters on a side. Tombs arranged in clusters containing exquisitely carved jade objects, jade pig dragons, jade hooked clouds, jade discs. Carving precision of these objects for a culture without metal tools is one of the small, persistent mysteries of East Asian archaeology. Mainstream Chinese archaeology classifies the Hongshan as a Neolithic ceremonial culture. Classification is correct so far as it goes. What is striking, for the comparative purpose of this analysis, is the simultaneous emergence in different parts of the world, Sumeria, Egypt, the Indus Valley, the Hongshan, of monumental ceremonial architecture, of elite burial with prestige goods, and of foundation traditions describing the arrival of culture from outside. The Korean foundation narrative, read against this archaeological background, places a sky descent event in this period and in this geographic zone. The Samguk Yusa names Mount Taebaek. The identification of Mount Taebaek is disputed. Korean nationalist historians, following Sin Chai-ho, identify it with Mount Paektu on the present Korean-Chinese border, a stratovolcano which erupted catastrophically in the 10th century CE, and which has been a site of foundation traditions for at least 2,000 years. Some scholars identify it instead with one of the peaks in the Liaoning Hills, closer to the Hongshan ceremonial sites. Either identification places the descent in a region where there was, during the relevant period, a real Neolithic to Bronze Age civilization performing rituals at platform mounds, burying its dead with carved jade, and constructing what may have been temple cities. Chain of consequences. If the Samguk Yusa account preserves transmitted memory of an actual event in this region, is significant. It would mean that the foundation date of 2333 BCE is not a medieval invention. It would mean that the descent narrative encodes some kind of arrival event, whether of a population, of a ruling class, of a cultural complex, and that the narrative was preserved with its specific details intact for roughly 3,500 years before Iryeon wrote it down. It would mean that the standard model of Korean origins, which treats Gojoseon as a much later Bronze Age state formation, is at least incomplete. It would also mean that the parallels between the Korean foundation narrative and the Sumerian Anunnaki accounts are not coincidental. The Anunnaki, in the Sumerian texts preserved in the Library of Ashurbanipal, and translated into modern languages by scholars including Samuel Noah, Kramer, and Stephen Langdon, descended from the heavens to specific cities. They brought specific cultural technologies, kingship, agriculture, the calendar. They had subordinates with elemental titles: Enlil, the Lord of the Wind, Adad, the Storm God. They established their authority at specific dates that the Sumerian king list, preserved on the Weld Blundell prism at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, gives in years that are not easily reconcilable with the conventional Bronze Age chronology of Mesopotamia. The Sumerian king list records 8 antediluvian kings who reigned for a combined 240,200 years. The numbers are not meant, in conventional reading, as literal lifespans, but they encode something. They encode a tradition that kingship descended from heaven, that it was held by specific named figures, and that the foundation occurred at a measurable point in time. The structural parallel with the Samguk Yusa is striking. A descent, specific named figures, specific cultural gifts, a specific foundation date, a specific geography. The two traditions are separated by roughly 7,000 kilometers, and by what should be, on conventional historical assumptions, no significant cultural contact. If you want to check this yourself, the museum catalogues are open. Kyujanggak Institute's catalogue is publicly available. the Samguk Yusa, can be consulted in person by qualified researchers and in facsimile by the general public. Sumerian king list sits in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford and is figured in the standard Assyriological literature. The comparison can be made. The geographic anchoring matters. Hwanung's descent in the Samguk Yusa occurs at a specific mountain, whether that mountain is Mount Paktu or one of the Liaoning peaks. The surrounding archaeological record shows a culture present in the Neolithic that mainstream archaeology has not yet integrated into the broader picture of Eurasian Bronze Age origins. The Sumerian descents occur at specific cities: Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, all of which have been excavated and all of which are real, locatable, and physically present in the modern archaeological record. The implication, then, is not that the Anunnaki and Hwanung are the same figures. The implication is that two unconnected traditions on opposite sides of the Eurasian landmass preserved the same structural account of how their respective civilizations began: descent, a teacher, specific cultural gifts, a foundation date. This is the part that the conventional reading has not yet engaged with. The conventional reading treats each tradition separately. The Sumerian descent is read as Mesopotamian mythology. The Korean descent is read as East Asian mythology. Parallel is not denied, it is simply not addressed. There is no published mainstream paper in any of the languages in which this comparative work would have to be done that takes both traditions in seriously simultaneously and asks why they share the same structure. Question is open. The data places a foundation event in the 3rd millennium BCE in northeastern Asia. The text describes that event in terms structurally identical to the Sumerian descent accounts, and the relationship between the two has not been examined. The academic response to the comparative question has been characterization rather than engagement. Western Korean studies, as a small but serious subdiscipline within East Asian studies, treats the Dangun account as part of the religious literature of medieval Korea. The standard reference works in English, Kibaik, Lees. A New History of Korea, Carter Eckert and others, Korea Old and New. The volumes of the Cambridge History of Korea treat the Samguk Yusa as a literary text and treat the foundation narrative as Buddhist-inflected mythology. None of these works engages with the specific date of 2333 BCE as a transmitted chronological tradition. None addresses the structural parallels with the Sumerian descent accounts, darts. None addresses the archaeological record of the Hongshan culture in relation to the textual tradition. This is not because the scholars are incompetent. They are not. It is because the discipline is structured to treat each cultural tradition within its own boundaries. The Sumerian material is the domain of Assyriologists. Korean material is the domain of Korean studies. Hongshan archaeology is the domain of Chinese prehistorians. There is no journal, no university department, no funding stream dedicated to bringing these traditions into systematic comparison. The work simply does not get done. Sin Chai-ho's analysis in the Korean language scholarship has been respected as nationalist historiography, but progressively treated as a period piece, a product of early 20th century Korean nationalism, rather than as a continuing line of inquiry. Specific textual arguments he made about the transmission of the foundation date have not been answered. They have been set aside. Mainstream Korean academic historians, working under the institutional pressures of post-war South Korean universities, and under the influence of post-war American and Japanese academic frameworks, have largely declined to revive the chronological question. Hwandan Gogi, the controversial Korean compilation that claims to preserve pre-Iryeon records of Korean antiquity, has been characterized as a 20th century forgery by mainstream Korean academia. the characterization is not unanimous, and a minority of credentialed Korean scholars have argued for the partial authenticity of some of its constituent texts. But the dominant academic position has been to set the Hwondan aside as outside the boundaries of serious of historical discussion. The asymmetry here is the standard one. Refutation requires engaging with specific claims. Dismissal requires only a characterization. Characterization of the Dangun Foundation narrative as religious mythology, of Sin Chai-ho's analysis as nationalist period writing, and of the comparative question as outside the discipline's boundaries, is sufficient to remove the question from active discussion. No counterpaper needs to be written. No alternative reading needs to be argued. The question simply does not appear on the agenda of any major journal in Korean studies, in Assyriology, or in comparative religion. This is the form of dismissal that the careful reader has learned to recognize. It is not a refutation, it is an absence. The academic literature does not say that the comparison between the Anunnaki accounts and the Dangun account fails on specific grounds. The academic literature does not say that the date of 2333 VCE is demonstrably a medieval invention. The academic literature does not engage. Questions are simply not asked. And the absence of the questions is treated as if it were an answer. There is, in particular, no published mainstream work that takes Zechariah Sitchin's reading of the Anunnaki descent and puts it in dialogue with the Korean Foundation tradition. Sitchin himself, who died in 2010, never wrote extensively on the Korean material. His work was Mesopotamia-focused. The comparative move would have required a different scholar, with a different set of language skills. And that scholar has not appeared in the mainstream academic literature. Sitchin's broader thesis, that the Anunnaki accounts describe physical visitors from elsewhere, is a contested interpretation. It has been criticized in detail by Assyriologists, who point to errors in his Sumerian readings and to interpretive choices that go beyond the textual evidence. Criticisms are real, and they have not been answered to the satisfaction of the discipline. But the criticisms of Sitchin's specific readings do not extend to the broader question of why descent narratives are structurally similar across cultures. That broader question has not been seriously addressed by mainstream comparative religion. What we have, then, is a configuration in which an alternative reading of the Korean Foundation account exists, has been argued by a credentialed Korean historian, has not been specifically refuted, and has structural parallels with traditions on the other side of Eurasia that have likewise not been specifically refuted in their broader claims. Thus, the mainstream academic response to this configuration is silence followed by characterization. The work has not been done. What this means for the viewer who wants to check is this: the Samguk Yusa exists. It can be examined in facsimile, and the relevant pages can be read in modern Korean translation. Sumerian king list exists, can be examined at the Ashmolean Museum, or in the standard published translations by Thorkild Jacobsen and Samuel Noah Kramer. The Hongshan archaeological record is published in peer-reviewed Chinese and English journals. The comparison is available. The mainstream has not made it. That is the dismissal. And the dismissal is essentially silence. To understand what was happening in northeastern Asia during the period the Samguk Yusa names as the founding era, it is necessary to step back and look at the broader civilizational context of the 3rd millennium BCE. This is the millennium in which the world's earliest written records appear. In southern Mesopotamia, the cuneiform script of the Sumerians develops out of an earlier pictographic system and reaches a mature form by approximately 3000 BCE. In Egypt, hieroglyphic writing emerges in the late 4th millennium, and stabilizes in the early dynasties. In the Indus Valley, an undeciphered script appears on seals and pottery. China, the antecedents of the oracle bone script of the Shang dynasty are visible in marks on pottery from sites dated to the Longshan period, contemporary with the late Hongshan. Korean peninsula at this time was not yet under the influence of Chinese script. The Hongshan culture in the Liaoning Hills was using a system of incised marks on pottery and on jade that may or may not be classifiable as proto-writing. Excavation reports from New Heliang and from the broader Hongshan zone describe consistent symbols that appear across multiple sites: circles, hooked curves, anthropomorphic figures, but no continuous textual record has been recovered. The goddess temple at New Heliang, partly subterranean, oriented north-south, is one of the few structures of its kind in East Asia. Inside it were found fragments of a clay female figure, larger than life-size, with inset jade eyes. The eyes are the part that gets attention. They are smoothed, polished pieces of nephrite, set into the clay sockets in a way that suggests intention rather than coincidence. Figure was deliberately broken in antiquity, before the temple was abandoned. Whether the breakage was ritual decommissioning or hostile destruction is not established. The jade work of the Hongshan deserves its own paragraph. The jade pig dragons, short curled objects with a snouted head and a coiled body, are made of nephrite, a stone with a Mohs hardness of approximately 6. The Hongshan's craftsmen did not have metal tools. They worked the jade with abrasives. Quartz sand, water and string saws cut with abrasive grit. Technical investment per object, measured in human hours, is large. Finished jade pig dragon represents probably hundreds of hours of skilled labour. The objects are found in elite burials, and their distribution across the Hongshan zone suggests a unified prestige system across a region larger than modern Belgium. Mainstream archaeology accepts these facts. The dispute is about what they mean. The conventional reading is that the Hongshan was a complex chiefdom organised around lineage rituals that did not develop into a state-level society and that was succeeded by other Neolithic and Bronze Age cultures in the same region. The alternative reading, advanced by some Chinese archaeologists since the 1990s, is that the Hongshan represents a state-level or near-state-level civilization that has been classified down because it does not fit the standard center-periphery narrative of early Chinese civilization. In this alternative reading, the Hongshan is not a Neolithic backwater on the road to the Shang. It is a separate, sophisticated civilization in its own right, contemporary with the late Uruk period in southern Mesopotamia. The relevance of this for the Korean Foundation tradition is that the Hongshan zone is, by most identifications, in or immediately adjacent to the region that the Samguk Yusa places at the centre of Hwanung's descent. Korean peninsula proper, in the 3rd millennium BCE, was occupied by the Mumun pottery culture, which begins around 1500 BCE in the conventional dating, but which has Neolithic antecedents reaching back several thousand years earlier. The connection between the Hongshan and later Korean cultures is debated. Some Korean archaeologists, working since the 1970s, have argued for a direct cultural connection running from the Hongshan through the Liaoning Bronze Age into early Gojoseon. Mainstream Chinese have generally been that the Hongshan is a Chinese Prengsa culture, ancestral to no specific later population in particular. Political stakes of the disagreement are obvious, and they affect the scholarship in both countries. What can be said with confidence is that the 3rd millennium BCE in northeastern Asia was not empty. It was occupied by a culture, or a complex of cultures, that were performing rituals at platform mounds, that were burying their elites with carved jade, that were organising labour on a scale that implies central coordination, and that were constructing ceremonial sites whose orientations correspond to astronomical events. Summer solstice sunrise at New Heliang, as observed from certain points in the ceremonial complex, aligns with specific landscape features in a way that suggests intention. The astronomical literacy of the Hongshan is comparable to that of the contemporary cultures of Mesopotamia and Egypt. In the Sumerian sources, the descent of the Anunnaki is associated with specific astronomical phenomena. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic compiled in its surviving form during the 2nd millennium BCE, but drawing on older Sumerian material, describes the establishment of the calendar by Marduk as part of the foundational ordering of the cosmos. Tablets of the astrolabes, including a series catalogued in the British Museum's Mesopotamian collection, list the heliacal risings of stars by month and by region of the sky. Mesopotamian astronomy was technical and observational from a very early period. Planisphere of Nineveh, a circular tablet found at the site of the Library of Ashurbanipal and held in room 55 of the British Museum, contains astronomical observations that the engineers Alan Bond and Mark Hempsel have argued, in their work published in 2008, encode the observation of a specific impact event in approximately 3123 BCE, a date close to the high end of the Hongshan ceremonial period. Bond and Hempsel are not fringe figures. Bond is an aerospace engineer who has worked on rocket propulsion systems, including the Sabre engine developed by Reaction Engines Limited. Hempsel is a spacecraft systems engineer formerly affiliated with Bristol University and with experience in the European space industry. Their analysis of the planisphere applies astronomical software back calculation to the constellation positions encoded on the tablet and produces a single specific date in the late 4th millennium BCE that the authors argue corresponds to an observed atmospheric event near a specific location in the eastern Mediterranean. The analysis has been criticized by Assyriologists, but no counter-calculation has been published that engages with the specific astronomical software output and shows where the back calculation breaks down. What does this have to do with Korea? The connection is not direct. Planisphere is a Mesopotamian object, and the date it encodes, if Bond and Hempsel's reading is correct, is roughly contemporary with the Hongshan ceremonial peak and several centuries before the Korean foundation date. But the structural point is the same. The artifacts of the 3rd millennium BCE encode specific astronomical and chronological information that the conventional readings of the texts have not exhausted. When that information is taken seriously and run through modern computational tools, it produces specific dates that the conventional chronologies do not predict. The deepening of this picture requires holding several things in mind at once. Korean tradition gives a specific founding date. The archaeological record of the broader region shows a sophisticated culture at the appropriate time. The Mesopotamian tradition gives a structurally parallel descent account. The Mesopotamian astronomical record contains observations that may correspond to specific events in the relevant period, and the academic disciplines that would have to bring all of these together are organized in ways that prevent the comparison from being made. The world of the 3rd millennium BCE, viewed as a single field rather than as a set of regional silos, looks different from the world of conventional textbook archaeology. It is a world in which sophisticated cultures emerge in multiple places nearly simultaneously, in which they share structural patterns in their foundation traditions, in which they record astronomical observations to a level of precision that strains the conventional account of how those observations could have been made, and in which the traditions of descent and arrival are persistent and specific. The Korean Foundation tradition is one of these traditions. It is not the most prominent. It is not the most studied. It is, in many ways, the most undiscussed of the major Eurasian Foundation accounts. The Samguk Yusa sits in the Kyujanggak Institute, available to qualified researchers. The Korean modern translation is in print. The English translation by Ha-tae Hung and Grafton K. Mintz was published by Yonsei University Press in 1972 and has been periodically reissued. The text is not hidden. The question is not difficult to ask. The question has simply not been asked at the level it deserves. The people who lived at New Heliang, whoever they were, watched the sky in the way that ancient peoples watched the sky. They marked the solstices. They aligned their structures to the cardinal directions. They carved jade with a precision that has no good explanation in terms of the tools they possessed. They buried their elites with prestige goods that imply long-distance trade networks. And they did all of this in the period that, several thousand years later, would be remembered in Korean tradition as the time of the descent. The Buddhist monk Iryeon, working in the 13th century, was not a credulous compiler. He was a senior religious figure in a sophisticated culture. He had access to records that no longer exist. He preserved a foundation narrative that he treated with care, distinguishing what he was quoting from what he was summarizing. He gave a specific date. He named specific figures. He described a specific event, whether what he preserved is the memory of an actual descent, the memory of a cultural arrival, the memory of a major astronomical or geological event interpreted as divine, or a literary construction shaped by religious tradition, is the question that the scholarship has not answered. Data is available. The artifacts are available. The texts are available. The question is open to Mount Taebaek by either identification, remains where it has always been. The Hongshan ceremonial sites remain where they were excavated. The Samguk Yusa remains in Seoul. The Sumerian descent texts remain in their museums. Parallels between them remain in the texts, waiting to be examined. There is a second tradition that requires attention here, and it is the tradition of Japan. In Japan, the foundation narrative is preserved in the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, two texts compiled in the early 8th century CE. Kojiki was completed in 712. The Nihon Shoki was completed in 720. Texts describe the descent of the heavenly grandson Ninigi no Mikoto to the peak of Mount Takachiho in southern Kyushu, accompanied by retainers bearing the three sacred treasures, the mirror, the sword and the jewel, that became the regalia of the imperial line. The structural parallel with the Korean account is precise. A heavenly figure descends to a specific mountain. The descent involves a transfer of authority from above. The descended figure, or his descendant, founds a state lineage. Specific objects of authority are brought from the heavenly realm to the earthly realm. The dating of the Japanese descent in the conventional reading places Ninigi several generations before the legendary first emperor Jimmu, whose accession is traditionally dated to 660 BCE. Traditional Japanese dating thus places the descent in roughly the 7th or 8th century BCE. The orthodox modern reading treats both Ninigi and Jimmu as legendary, with no historical correspondence, and treats the 8th century compilations of the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki as religious literature constructed to legitimize the Yamato imperial line. Complications is that the Japanese tradition is structurally identical to the Korean tradition in ways that the conventional reading has not fully addressed. Descent, a specific mountain, a transfer of authority, sacred objects, a founding date. The cultural transmission between the Korean peninsula and the Japanese archipelago in the first millennium BCE is well attested archaeologically. The Yayoi period in Japan beginning around the 5th century BCE, shows direct material continuity with Korean Bronze Age cultures. Question is whether the structural parallel of the foundation narrative reflects that documented cultural transmission, or whether both traditions preserve a shared earlier substrate that predates the documented contact. More disputed Japanese source is the Takenouchi manuscripts, claimed by their custodians to descend from a tradition orally preserved by the Takenouchi family over many generations, and committed to writing repeatedly across the medieval and early modern periods. Texts, as they exist today, were primarily organized in their current form in the early 20th century. They claim to preserve accounts of a primordial age in which a heavenly dynasty ruled the earth from a sacred mountain, and they include specific names, specific places, and specific durations that mainstream Japanese historians regard as unsupportable. Takenouchi manuscripts are not accepted as authentic pre-modern documents by mainstream Japanese academic historians. They are, however, important for the comparative question because they explicitly link the Japanese foundation tradition with a broader Eurasian descent tradition, naming figures that correspond, in the Takenouchi system, to the Korean Hwanin and Hwanung, and to figures in the Chinese Three Sovereigns tradition. Whether the Takenouchi manuscripts preserve genuine older tradition, or whether they are a modern composite. The comparative point stands independently. Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, which are unambiguously 8th century compilations of older material, contain a descent narrative structurally identical to the Korean Samguk Yusa account, which is a 13th century compilation of older material. The Mesopotamian sources, including the Enuma Elish and the Sumerian King List, contain descent narratives that are structurally identical to both. The geographic span of these parallel traditions is the full breadth of Eurasia. The conventional explanations for cross-cultural narrative parallels are well known, and they are not foolish. Diffusion accounts for some parallels, narratives spread from one culture to another through trade and migration. Coincidence accounts for some parallels. Humans facing similar problems generate similar stories. Shared mythological inheritance accounts for some parallels. The deep ancestry of Indo-European and other language families carries narrative patterns across thousands of years. None of these explanations, taken individually, fully accounts for the specific correspondence between the Korean and the Sumerian descent accounts. Diffusion is implausible, given the absence of documented contact between Mesopotamia and the Korean peninsula in the relevant period. Coincidence is weak when the parallel includes specific structural elements. The descent, the subordinates, the cultural gifts, the founding date, rather than generic mythological motifs. Shared inheritance is possible, but would require a very deep substrate, predating the separation of the linguistic and cultural ancestors of the relevant populations. The independent attestation matters. Two unconnected traditions on opposite sides of the largest landmass on Earth preserve structurally identical accounts of how civilization began. The accounts include specific dates that fall in the same broad period of human history. The accounts include specific geographic, anchoring to mountains and to ritual sites that, in both cases, correspond to documented archaeological remains, and the accounts use parallel vocabulary for subordinate figures. Elemental titles in the Korean case, elemental deities in the Sumerian case. The standard mainstream explanation does not engage with the specific correspondences. It treats the Korean tradition as East Asian religious literature, the Sumerian tradition as Mesopotamian mythology, and the structural parallel as either coincidence or as too deep in the human mythological inheritance to be analytically tractable. Reader, who has read both sets of texts, notices that this is not a sufficient explanation. The reader asks the question the discipline does not ask. The question is whether the parallel reflects a real shared event, a real shared substrate, or a real shared pattern of how civilizations remember their own origins. The cross-cultural attestation is the part of the case worth returning to repeatedly. One tablet, one museum, one text. That is interesting but not yet a pattern. Two texts on opposite sides of Eurasia describing the same structural event. That is the beginning of a pattern. Add the Mesoamerican Popol Vuh, with its account of the heavenly descent of the makers of human beings. Add the Egyptian pyramid texts at Saqqara, with their accounts of the descent of the gods to the founding sites of Egyptian kingship. Add the Vedic Rig Veda, with its descents of celestial beings. The pattern is not local. Pattern is global. And the academic literature has, with rare exceptions, not engaged with the pattern at the level the texts deserve. The strongest counter-argument to the reading proposed here is the diffusionist argument. Advanced in its most careful form by historians of religion working in the comparative mythology tradition, the argument runs as follows. Foundation narratives describing descent from above to a sacred mountain are a near-universal feature of pre-modern religious literature. They are found across the Indo-European world, in Semitic traditions, in Sino-Tibetan traditions, in Austronesian and Polynesian traditions, in the Americas, and in sub-Saharan Africa. The universality of the pattern can be explained by structural features of human religious cognition. The association of height with authority, the role of mountains as visible landmarks in the landscape, the metaphorical mapping of social hierarchy onto vertical space, without requiring any specific historical event to have happened. Host. In this reading, the Korean Wanung descent and the Sumerian Anunnaki descent are not parallel because they remember the same event. They are parallel because they are generated by the same human cognitive machinery, operating on the same kinds of landscape, and the same kinds of social structures. Mircea Eliade's classic studies of the axis mundi, the cosmic mountain at the centre of the world, develop this argument in detail across many cultures. This is a serious counter-argument. It accounts for a great deal of the structural parallel. It does not require positing any specific event in the 3rd millennium BCE. Cost. It is consistent with the broader patterns of comparative mythology as the discipline has developed across the 20th century. The element it does not fully account for is the specificity of the dates and of the catalogued cultural gifts. Eliade's analysis is at the level of the structural pattern. It does not engage with the question of why the Korean tradition fixes a specific year, 2333 BCE, rather than a generic ancient time. It does not engage with the question of why the Sumerian king list gives specific reign durations that produce a specific antediluvian total of 241,200 years. Cognitive universal argument predicts that traditions will be generally similar. It does not predict that they will share specific numerical anchors. This is the residue of the counter case. The structural parallel is largely explained by universal cognitive patterns. The specific numerical parallels are not. Further counter-argument concerns the dating of the Samguk Yusa source material. Conventional position is that whatever older Korean records Iryeon worked from cannot be reconstructed in detail, and that we therefore cannot establish how old the foundation date really is in Korean tradition. The date might have been calculated by a 10th century Korean scholar, working backward from Chinese chronology. It might have been calculated by a 13th century scholar in Iryeon's circle. We do not have the underlying records, and absent the underlying records, the claim that the date is genuinely transmitted from antiquity cannot be conclusively established. This is the strongest narrow point. The conventional reading is correct, that the underlying sources are lost. Sin Chao's argument from the consistency of the date across multiple medieval Korean witnesses is suggestive but not conclusive. Date might be original to the medieval period. What can be said is that the question remains genuinely unresolved. Neither the conventional reading nor the alternative reading rests on settled ground. Debate is open. The texts are available. The arguments on both sides are findable in the published literature. The reader can examine them and decide if the reading proposed here is substantially correct. If the Samguk Yusa preserves a transmitted memory of a 3rd millennium BCE foundation event in northeastern Asia, and if that event is parallel to events recorded in the Sumerian, Egyptian, and Mesoamerican traditions, then the standard chronology of how human civilization began would require revision in several specific places. The dating of state-level organization on the Korean peninsula would move from the conventional 1st millennium BCE assignment to a date in the 3rd millennium BCE. The relationship between the Hongshan archaeological culture and later Korean civilizations would require reassessment. The siloing of Mesopotamian and East Asian early history would be a methodological failure rather than a disciplinary convenience. More broadly, the question of whether the descent narratives across Eurasia reflect a shared event, a shared substrate, or a shared pattern of religious cognition would become a genuinely open empirical question rather than a settled mythological category. Mesopotamian astronomical observations, the Korean foundation chronology, the Egyptian pyramid texts, and the Mesoamerican calendars would have to be examined together. The Samguk Yusa is real. It sits in the Kyujanggak Institute at Seoul National University. The Sumerian king list sits in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. Hongshan jade is in regional Chinese museums and in the collections of the Liaoning Provincial Museum. Texts are published. The artifacts are catalogued. The question of what they together mean has not been answered. It remains open. The Samguk Yusa is in the Kyujanggak Institute for Korean Studies. The book is available. Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki are in the Japanese national collections. They are available. Sumerian King List is in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. Planisphere of Nineveh is in room 55 of the British Museum. The Hongshan Jade is in the Liaoning Provincial Museum. They are all available. Iryeon wrote in 1281. Sin Chaiho wrote in the early 1920s and died in a Japanese prison in 1936. Bond and Hempsell published in 2008. The work has been done. The work is published. It is in the libraries. What Hwanung was said to have brought to Mount Taebaek, and what Dangun was said to have founded in 2333 BCE, is still open. It has been open since Iryeon set down the account in the 13th century. It has been open since Sin Chayo asked, in the early 20th century, whether the date was transmitted or invented. It is still open now.